My name is Larry Temple, and on behalf of the Lyndon B. Johnson Foundation, I want to welcome all of you to the Tom Johnson Lecture. What I'd like to do tonight at the outset is to have a moment of silence for the victims in Las Vegas of the worst shooting that the history of this country has ever had. So I ask for a moment of silence for those victims. Thank you. The Tom Johnson Lecture was created by the LBJ Foundation to honor the man who served for 30 years as chairman of the foundation. He continues today as the chairman emeritus of the foundation. I want to tell you just a bit about Tom because Tom's life story is the story of America. Tom has been one of the eminent journalists of this country for his whole adult life. He started at age 14 as a stringer for a small newspaper in Macon, Georgia. After college, he was in the first class of the White House Fellows in 1965. He so impressed a fellow named Bill Moyers and another person named Lyndon Johnson that he stayed on in a professional capacity with the president, ultimately became deputy press secretary under the legendary George Christian. When President Johnson left office, Tom came back here with him and ran the former president's office here. From there, he went to Dallas and was the publisher of the Dallas Times-Herald. He wasn't the cause of it going out of business. It won a lot of awards while he was there. From there, he went to Los Angeles and ultimately became the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. What happened while he was there? They won 6 Pulitzer Prizes, and he was picked as the Publisher of the Year. He got pulled away from there by Ted Turner and went to CNN, where he became the president of CNN. And while he was at CNN, and he won every award for journalism that their profession has to offer. After his retirement is where I think he got his sea legs. Tom did retire from CNN, and what he has done since then, I think, has been one of the most remarkable, truly remarkable acts that this country has seen. Tom openly announced to the world that he had been suffering from depression most of his adult life. And he told people that there wasn't anything to be embarrassed about, there wasn't any reason to be ashamed of depression, it's just an illness. It's an illness that can be combated if people will deal with it, and there's medicine to take care of it. And Tom has saved countless and countless lives in this country by being out front about depression. I think he's the leader in this country in trying to combat depression. And even now, he started even a new facet of that, and he has taken the lead in setting up adolescent mental health facility. So many of our young people have gotten involved with problems of depression, suicide, and all kinds of mental health issues, and Tom is now taking the lead in trying to do something about that, raising money, and will set up a facility to deal with adolescent mental health. So he is a man that has spent his whole life making progress and doing good, and still does that even today. So before we get started, Tom, stand up. I want to acknowledge Tom Johnson here. Now, at this point in the program, I was going to introduce my colleague, Ben Barnes, who in turn was going to introduce Vice President Biden. But Vice President Biden is not here. He has gotten delayed because of problems with the airplane. I think he's in the process of landing right about now, or if he's not landed already, will have landed pretty soon. So those of you that got a good price for your ticket coming here are going to get a twofer tonight. Mark Updegrove, the former director of the LBJ Library, and in my judgment, the best interviewer of anybody in this country, was going to have a conversation with Vice President Biden, and he still will when Vice President Biden gets here. But to not just pass the time, but have an advantage for all of you, Bill McRaven, former head of the Special Forces in this country, who took out Osama bin Laden and now is the Chancellor of the University of Texas System, has agreed to engage in a conversation with Mark Updegrove until Vice President Biden gets here. So Vice President Biden is coming. He's been doing his darndest since about 2 o'clock this afternoon to get here, and will be here shortly. But in the meantime, I want to ask you to welcome to the stage Admiral William McRaven, Chancellor of the University of Texas System, who will be engaged in a conversation with Mark Updegrove. Bill, Mark.
Well, what a warm-up act, I guess.
Well, what a treat for me. I get to talk to not just one great American tonight, but two great Americans with Bill McRaven. So thank you for your willingness to do this, Bill. I want to start off, one of the images that the folks saw when they came in, there was a montage of photographs of Vice President Biden's illustrious career as a public servant. But one of the pictures that the audience saw was Vice President Biden, President Obama, Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary of Defense Gates, and others in the Situation Room listening to you talk about the raid on Osama bin Laden. What do you remember about that day? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so we're going to tell some stories out of school here, I guess, to keep the audience entertained. I will tell you that was an interesting moment. At the time, I was in Afghanistan. We had a small base right on the border, from which I was commanding the raid. And I had sent the general officer, the Air Force officer you see there sitting in the middle of that table, is Brigadier General Brad Webb. He was one of my officers. So I sent him to the White House to be kind of our liaison and to be able to answer any questions that Chairman Mike Mullen might have that he would relay to the President and the members of the National Security Council that were there. So the idea was the President and all those people you see in that photo, they were never going to see my face. They were never going to hear me. We were going to work through this Brigadier General. So at some point in time in the raid, as the raid is unfolding, Chairman Mike Mullen, the four-star admiral in charge of the entire Joint Chiefs, would duck out every once in a while. He would get an update from Brad Webb, and then he would get back into the Situation Room, and he would brief the President. At one point in time, the President said, "Mike, where are you getting this information?" And Mullen had assured me that he was not going to let everybody look in on the mission as we were conducting it. And so Mullen tap danced a little bit, and he said, "Well, Mr. President, we've got an officer that's providing this." And he says, "Well, where is that officer?" And Mullen said, "Sir, he's right next door." So the President says, "You mean right next door?" I said, "Yes, sir." So the next thing I get, we're on a chat. So my executive officer sitting next to me, he is actually chatting with this officer in the White House as we're relaying information to him. So all of a sudden I've got the headphones on, I'm watching the mission unfold, and my executive officer turns to me and says, "Admiral, General Webb says the Vice President has just walked into the room." I thought, oh, this didn't sound too good. All of a sudden, and he goes, "Sir, the President just walked into the room." And so this typing is coming fast and furious. And he says, "Sir, the chairman said, sir, they're all in the room." And I said, "You know, Brad, handle it. I'm a little busy right now." So the iconic photo you see there, of course, as they come in, it's a little anteroom, and you see it's not very big. Of course, at that point in time, now they are looking at the video that I was watching from my location in Afghanistan. So they are now seeing the action unfold. And of course, they walked in right as the helicopter that was approaching the compound had a hard landing and turned sideways and kind of crashed onto the wall along the compound of Abbottabad. Not a good way to start, the President's evening briefing, I think. But I got to tell you, the president and his team were fabulous. Never once until really the mission was almost over did the president ask me any questions, talk to me. He knew I had a mission to run. I was working with Director Leon Panetta at the CIA. So that iconic photo, Brad Webb, the general, when he came back the next day, I saw him about 2 days later, and he said, "Sir, I thought you'd think this photo was interesting." And of course, the interesting photo became the photo of the year. And I told Brad, for the next 100 years, you're going to be the man in the middle of that picture.
What's going through your mind when that operation is going down?
Yeah, these are the sort of operations that we did on a daily basis. I mean, my life was about going after bad guys, trying to capture or, if necessary, kill high-value individuals. So this was something we did as a matter of routine. We generally took helicopters. We would fly by helicopter to a compound in Iraq or Afghanistan, wherever it might be. You can kind of patrol from a distance. You can surround the compound, and then hopefully the bad guy comes out. But if he doesn't, you have to kind of go in and get him. But of course, in this case, we had planned to get into the compound and get bin Laden. But as that helicopter went down, one, I knew right away that the guys were safe. So I think the folks that you see in that photo, as they see it, of course, it's a helicopter crash. And because the helicopter did spin and it landed hard, but having seen a lot of helicopter crashes, I knew it wasn't a crash. I knew it was just a hard landing. I'm listening to the guys on the radio. I pretty much know they're okay within a matter of seconds, and we had plan B, so they're moving on to plan B. So we just had to continue to execute the mission. And again, I was too focused on making sure the guys got in, got the mission complete, and got out of there safely to really care about much else at that point in time.
Right. We've got the Vice President coming shortly. Bill, what are your recollections of the Vice President and your working relationship?
I'll tell you, I would always see, or almost always see, the Vice President with President Obama, and they were a magnificent team. And as you will see when the Vice President comes, he is very outgoing, he is very gregarious, he is very engaging, and he just has that personality that the first time you meet him, you feel like you're old friends. And he is, you hear it often when you talk about public officials, and somebody will say, yep, they remembered who I was. And that is the way, Vice President Biden was. He would remember who you were, and little bits of information that, how's your wife, Georgianne, doing? How are those? And again, that always gave you a sense of comfort. But I got to tell you, he was also the guy that had to question whether or not everything was, in fact, the way the president saw it. So in the case of the raid, after a while, there was a little bit of groupthink going on, I think, in terms of, is this the right mission? Well, Vice President Biden, to his credit, I think told the president, Mr. President, I'm not sure this is the right decision. And Vice President Biden talks about that pretty openly now. And you needed that counterbalance. And this is why I think they were such a great team. The president always gets a lot of advice, and you need somebody that says, Mr. President, is this the right advice? Let's talk about this. Let's work this through. And again, you saw not only a partnership in the president and the vice president, but a friendship. I think a very deep friendship. And I can tell you, having obviously not been in that leadership position, but having been in leadership positions most of my life, having the number 2 guy or gal that's part of your organization not only be your closest professional confidant, but your closest friend, it makes all the difference in the world.
It's not unique in that situation, but it's certainly unusual.
It is.
That is a relationship that's inherently fraught with tension, just given the nature of the two roles. We talked about bad guys, Osama bin Laden, of course, being one of them. We are seeing a bad guy in North Korea, dubbed Little Rocket Man by the president, rattling sabers once again.
Right.
And that seems to be something that we see from North Korean leadership regularly. We saw it from Kim Il-sung. We saw it from Kim Jong-un. Now we see it from Kim Jong-il. Now we see it from Kim Jong-un. Is it different this time, Bill?
Yeah, I don't know that it's different, other than the fact that the father and the grandfather were working hard to get a nuclear weapon and then to miniaturize it. The difference with Kim Jong-un is he has nuclear weapons. So he has open source, we'll tell you, somewhere around 20 nuclear weapons. So a lot of people think that, North Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. No, they actually have nuclear weapons. The issue for him is miniaturizing it and putting it on an intercontinental ballistic missile or some sort of missile that has some range to it. So we have to some degree, crossed the Rubicon, or he has crossed the Rubicon in terms of he has those weapons. He's not going to stop at anything to miniaturize that and put it on a rocket. And of course, again, with his father and grandfather, you could have this rhetoric, and the rhetoric was there, but the real threat wasn't there. Now what we have is not only the rhetoric, but the real threat of potential nuclear war because he has nuclear weapons. My sense of things is he will stop at nothing, absolutely nothing, to be able to miniaturize that and put it on an ICBM. So while I think we can continue and we need to work with China, I think this is an important part of our strategy. We can put all the sanctions on him we want. I do not see him stopping the progress. I think what scares, again, the intelligence community is he's probably moving, his scientists are moving faster than we thought they could. So they have kind of hit a threshold. We thought, well, maybe it'll be a year and a half, maybe it'll be 2 years. I think if you talk to most Intel analysts today, they'd say that's probably been truncated quite a bit, and it could be a lot faster than we thought. So the question is, what are our options? And our options are really not very good. We have to continue to engage China. We have to engage South Korea. As you know, President Moon of South Korea has been unwilling to put the THAAD missile system, anti-missile system, which is the Theater High-Altitude Air Defense System. We need to make sure we have the right amount of cruisers and destroyers with Aegis-class capability, which is the ability to shoot down a ballistic missile. We have to work with the Japanese. We have to recognize that sooner or later, KJU, Kim Jong-un, is probably going to get to where he needs to get to. A lot of people have said, well, why don't you take him out? Because the default position, every single action in North Korea, when we do anything that crosses their border, is launch artillery on Seoul. So along the demilitarized zone, there are thousands of pieces of artillery that are within reach of Seoul. And of course, Seoul, many millions in Seoul, to include about 28 to 30,000 US soldiers. So if you take out KJU, artillery rains in on Seoul. If you take out a missile on a launch pad, artillery rains into Seoul. If you shoot down a missile in high trajectory, artillery rains in on Seoul. So again, we're in a very difficult position right now when it comes to dealing with North Korea. However, having said that, I actually think that the President and General Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, certainly I like the fact that Secretary Tillerson is out trying to engage with North Korea. Now, some folks would say, why would you do that? I think you want to keep all your options open. You have to engage on one side, you have to have a diplomatic effort. At the same time, you need to make sure the North Koreans understand, if you continue to pursue this, we will in fact take actions, and that action will not serve you well. So you got to kind of play both ends of the field, I think.
Did the president undermine his own Secretary of State when he tweeted over the weekend, we'll take it from here, Rex? Yeah. Don't bother with diplomatic efforts?
Well, I think, again, you see what happens with the president's tweets, and then to some degree, how the National Security Council and the security network, Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, others, they function, I think, within a broad framework. I think they understand the president, to some degree, works to his base, and his base may say, hey, we're not going to negotiate. I think Secretary Tillerson is right in continuing this path, and I think he will probably continue it unless the president gives him a direct order to stop, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Right. There have been a lot of distractions lately. We've had hurricanes. We had the mass shootings in Las Vegas, which I'll talk to Vice President Biden about. We have North Korea rattling sabers. What gives you the greatest concern in the world that we're not seeing in the headlines, that we're not tweeting about, that we're not talking about on a daily basis?
Pre-K through 12. Yeah. I will tell you unequivocally, the greatest national security threat we have right now is how poorly we are educating our kids in pre-K through 12. We need to figure out how to fix this system, because in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, if we do not have an educated population, one that really has in the academic sense, a broad liberal education, understanding different cultures, understanding different ideas, being able to have these conversations with people that you don't always agree with. If we don't explain to them and teach them and educate them, then what will our population, what will our citizenry look like in 20 years? So I would tell you we need to find a way to make sure we are doing everything we can to educate our young men and women. You know, I think we're doing actually a pretty good job in higher education. I mean, I am very, very proud of the University of Texas system. Frankly, all the systems in Texas, I think, do a great job of educating our young men and women. But you realize how many actually get here. And if you start with 100 kids in 8th grade, 100 of them, only 20 of them will make it to college. Mm-hmm. So that is not a very good statistic. We've got to change that.
So what's the chief culprit?
Well, you know, Bill McRaven's personal opinion is we've got to have leadership at in the independent school districts and at the high schools and the middle schools. You know, being in the military, my wife and I moved about every 2 years in our career. And I had a chance to see, we always in public schools, I think, except for once we sent my daughter to a middle school, Catholic middle school. Other than that, all public schools. And the differentiator between a successful public school and an unsuccessful one was always the principal. If you had a strong principal who understood leadership principles, who understood how to pull the families together, how to work the faculty, what was important in terms of, and I hate to use this kind of military term, but kind of good order and discipline within the school, if you don't have some level of discipline within the school, then the young men and women aren't going to learn, in my opinion, aren't going to learn at the rate they need to. That only happens when you have a strong principle that lays down, hey, these are kind of the rules in terms of how you're going to go to school. And you got to engage with the parents. You've got to get them involved. But it all starts, I think, with the principal. If you have weak teachers, a strong principal can make up for that. If you have strong teachers but a weak principal, at least in my experience, it doesn't work very well. So you've got to have training for the principals and give them the opportunity to really kind of shape in a positive fashion the work that goes on at their school.
Does the training of those principals come at a federal level, come at a state level, come at a district level? How does it happen?
Yeah, I think it's got to be at the local level.
Okay.
Now, again, that doesn't mean that you don't need state support or even federal support, but there's got to be a recognition that we have to train, I mean, not only the principals, but obviously the teachers, and we've got to make sure the infrastructure is there. We've got a lot to do, and this is the problem. When you talk about a national security problem, it's a huge problem, in my opinion, in terms of educating our youth. You can't just get the principals. There's a whole lot of issues surrounding it that we could spend hours trying to tackle. But I do think, you know, we've got a great College of Education here at the University of Texas at Austin. But unfortunately, only about 33% of the teachers in pre-K through 12 actually went to a school of education, College of Education. A lot of them are just you know, great folks that got their bachelor's or their master's, and then they get certified as a teacher and they go teach. Nothing wrong with that. We have to have those great folks. But I think you also need to make sure that we grow our potential teachers in a way that they understand really how to run a classroom, how to educate these kids, how to work with the principal. There's a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
You've been in this job a couple of years now. What's been the greatest surprise to you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, there haven't been any real surprises in terms of running a large organization. When I left, I was the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. We had 70,000 men and women, about a $10 billion budget. The things I did to run that command are almost exactly what I do here. I mean, you had a budget, you had to manage budget. I had to go to Capitol Hill, I had to justify my budget, I had to go to hearings. I had as the Special Operations Command, I had 12, as we referred to them as subordinate commanders. So I had 12 different presidents, if you will, that worked for me. Here I've got 14. But some of my subordinate commanders, for example, I had 2 of them were 3 stars. I had a couple of 2 stars. I had a couple of 1 stars, you know. It's a little bit the same way here. You know, you have MD Anderson, and you have UT Austin, you have Southwestern, you have some great health science center in San Antonio and Houston. I have to give the presidents the latitude to do their job. I mean, that's my responsibility as a servant leader. It is about making sure that Greg Fenves here and Peter Pister at MD Anderson and Dan Podolsky up at Southwestern, that they have the resources they need to get the job done, give them the latitude, let them be the president. Right. But at the same time, the reason you have a system is so that you can work on those things that are important to your size and scale. So the health industry we have with the 6 health-related institutions, you have to move them to some degree together as a single institution so you can maximize the service that you provide to the patients in the state of Texas. Right. So nothing has really surprised me. I'll qualify that. What has, I know it surprised me, but I am very pleased by it, is incredibly pleased, is the quality of my staff at the system administration. So if you think of us as kind of the four-star headquarters, I have just some remarkable professionals that work for me. And people say, well, you came here, but you know, I'm not a doctor. Well, I've got Ray Greenberg, a great MD, PhD that works for me. I got David Daniel, who was the president of UT Dallas. They are remarkable at what they do in terms of serving the other institutions.
I'm not only talking to the Chancellor of the University of Texas system, I'm talking to a best-selling author. Make Your Bed has sold 300,000 copies, which is just astounding. Congratulations. Did you have any idea when you made that speech that it would gain such momentum?
Oh, absolutely not. The interesting thing about the speech is Bill Powers had called me up and said, look, we'd like you to do the commencement address. But I had a day job, so you know, a couple of weeks out, I start working on it. And about Wednesday of the Saturday before I'm supposed to give it, I look at the speech and it doesn't work. I mean, my theme that I had planned, it wasn't coming to kind of the end like I was hoping. So I'm panicking just a little bit. So I go to Georgianne and I said, the speech isn't working. I can't make it work. And she says, why don't you write about something you know? I thought, well, there's a bit of wisdom. And I said, look, the only thing I know is how to be a Navy SEAL. She said, well, then write about your experience as a Navy SEAL. And if you recall at that time, Condoleezza Rice was scheduled to go and give a commencement speech, and the students decided they didn't want her to come, and so she elected not to come. I'm thinking, so I'm going to stand up in front of 8,000 students and another 20,000 parents in a uniform on what I assumed was, you know, a college campus. How would they take a guy in uniform giving the commencement address? So I decided to look back on my time in SEAL training, and I pulled the kind of 10 life lessons from SEAL training. And as I said at the beginning of the speech, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference whether you ever wore the uniform. It didn't make a difference whether you were a male or female, or your orientation or your ethnic background. These were life lessons. And I was just pleased that it resonated with the students and the parents. It was a lot of fun to do, and there's not a day goes by that somebody doesn't come up to me and say, hey, I make my bed. And
apparently I need to send my 17-year-old son to you.
Yeah.
Bill, what is your view of the state of our military?
Well, I think the state of our military remains incredibly strong. The problem is they're stressed. And I mean, you can see the results. As you know, we had 2 accidents with the Fitzgerald and McCain out in the Pacific. And I can tell you, not knowing, and you always have to be careful because I don't know the full details. What I do know is that the Navy has, of course, already relieved the fleet commander and the 2 commanding officers, which is when the Navy sees a problem, the Navy moves pretty quickly. And the investigation will tell us really kind of what led to this. But whatever the investigation determines, we have to ask ourselves, how in the world could this have happened? In light of the technology that's on that ship, in light of the training that we give these sailors. And a lot of this could be the fact that, one, are we giving them enough training? Or have we stretched these crews too thin? Are the ships kind of constantly rotating in the Pacific and in the Mediterranean? And I think it's true of all of the service components. You know, we are an all-volunteer force. And we are a small all-volunteer force relative to what we were, you know, just 20, 30 years ago. So, and we are out, you know, fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We are in, you know, probably 140 countries around the world. The U.S. military is, and we're sailing the seas and we're patrolling the skies. And that takes a toll, I think, on the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And so there is no doubt in my mind we are by far and away the finest military, and I would contend the finest military that this nation and maybe the world has ever seen. When you look at the fact that these soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that came in after 9/11, certainly the soldiers and the Marines and a lot of the sailors, they've been in combat continuously since 9/11. There is nothing, unfortunately, you know, war does a couple things. You always get better medicine at the end of the war because the docs are so involved in, You look at the trauma that occurs, the docs become good and the soldiers become good, unfortunately, as a result of war. But they're very, very good at what they do. The problem is, how long can we sustain, this continual deployment cycle that we're on? And I know General Joe Dunford, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and of course, Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, they look at this every day.
You mentioned ISIS. We're not hearing a lot about ISIS right now. There are other big things in the world that we're concentrating on. What is the state of our fight against ISIS right now?
I think we're making good progress against ISIS. When you take a look at Mosul, so ISIS, when you take a look at the swath that ISIS had, it was in the Western Desert in Iraq, up in Mosul, and Mosul is several million people up in Mosul. They had a large part of Mosul that they controlled. Of course, when you go into Syria, their center of gravity, as we say in the military, is in the city of Raqqa, about 300,000. Right. When it's bustling, it's not 300,000 anymore. So the Iraqi army, with U.S. Special Operations, with the larger military, has of course pushed them out of Mosul. We have forces. We are working with the Syrian Democratic Force in Syria, and we have pushed them on the outskirts of Raqqa. So we have made a lot of progress into Raqqa. ISIS will crumble as an existential threat, certainly to Iraq. But ISIS as an ideology will just continue to morph. It's a little bit like Al-Qaeda. And people may not know, ISIS started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, back in 2004 timeframe. So the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, after things settled down for a little bit, they went to Syria, they kind of regrouped. Al-Baghdadi, rises up with ISIS, and the next thing you know, they're an army on the march. Well, they're still a threat, and I don't want to downplay the threat, and unfortunately, we've lost a lot of certainly special operations soldiers. We've lost over 20 special operations soldiers this year alone in Iraq and Afghanistan. People think the war is over. The war isn't over for a lot of the guys, and it's not just the special operations guys. We've got great infantrymen and great pilots out there. The problem with ISIS is it will morph. We will see ISIS in Indonesia. We will see ISIS in parts of Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. It will continue to morph as an ideology. What I think will collapse in ISIS, though, over the course of the next year will be their ability to really raise an army and do like you saw them carrying the black flags into Iraq. I think those days, you hate to speculate because the next thing you know is you're wrong, but I think we have done a sizable amount of damage to them. It's just whether or not they will morph and be something else in the future, or continue to be ISIS, but in pockets around the world.
Bill, you've been a great sport for coming on stage and having this wonderful conversation. It looks like the Vice President here. Please, please. So, please come back. Please come back to finish the conversation. How are you? I'll mark Updegrove. Good to see you, Katie. Mr. Vice President, Mark Updegrove.
Hey, good to see you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to introduce the Vice President of the United States. It's also a great honor, if you're from De Leon, Texas, to get to interrupt an admiral during the middle of his speech, I assure you. So I've got two great honors tonight. I've got a long introduction of the Vice President, and I would mean every word of it. And he's deserving of what I could say and what all the people in this room know about him and what they could say. But you came here to hear the Vice President. I want to say this about Joe Biden. Joe Biden, in the past 8 years, stood very tall with the President of the United States, and he had his back. He had his back during the recession. He had his back in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had his back on the passage of Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare. But he not only had the President's back, he had the back of the American people. And I know of no man that I have served with or known in public office that I had rather have protecting my back and the back of the American people than Joe Biden. Joe Biden Joe Biden is a man with a heart and compassion and loves this country. And I know of no person that's better qualified today than to keep the American dream alive. He's done it yesterday, he's done it today, and he's got the capacity to keep the American dream alive tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming the 37th Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Stevenson said, flattery is great as long as you don't inhale. Thank you, Ben.
Mr. Vice President, welcome. Welcome. We're honored to have you at the LBJ Presidential Library. I want to start, Mr. Vice President, by talking about your background, your origins. You are a product of hardscrabble, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and product of two very strong parents. Talk about your parents and the values that they instilled in you that have guided your public career.
With your permission, am I on here? Yeah. I want to say something about the man that just exited the stage. Not only my friend, Governor Barnes, but Admiral McRaven. I have had the great honor of, not because of my importance, because of the jobs I've had, of being involved with national security since I was a 30-year-old kid. I think I was the youngest person ever on the Foreign Relations Committee. I chaired that committee for years, and I was on the Intelligence Committee, and I was an integral part of the national security team. And in my entire career, one of the greatest honors I've had was working with Admiral McRaven. And that's not hyperbole. I just want to tell you two things about him, if I may. And I'm sorry to take the time.
Not at all.
You know, we learned, and I'm not going to be able to tell you everything, but some is still classified, but we learned, no, I mean, I'm being very earnest about that. I'm being very serious. We learned as early as August, before bin Laden was taken the following year, that bin Laden was in Abbottabad in Pakistan. And the President and I, and only 5 other people knew, because we were afraid if we didn't even tell who we trusted completely, the director of the FBI or the Homeland Security or the Secretary of State. There were people that it was kept incredibly close. And we called in Admiral McRaven and the Navy SEALs. And watching him plan that raid, sitting with him hours upon hours upon hours in the Situation Room, watching how brilliant and composed and focused this man was. He erected an entire replica of the compound that bin Laden was at, or at least we thought. We didn't know for sure to the day we got there. And watching that famous scene, you see the President and me and others in the Situation Room watching in real time the raid to get bin Laden. I was told by other folks in the intelligence community that when that helicopter crashed against the wall and changed the entire nature of the operation, that Admiral McRaven's pulse actually went down. No, I'm not joking. I am not joking. This is a man of enormous, enormous capacity and judgment. And of all the things I've done in my career, and I've met every major head of state in the last 42 years because of the nature of my job. I've met an awful lot of impressive people, but I've never met anybody with the courage, the gumption, and the values that Admiral McRaven possesses. It's been an honor to have worked with him. I mean that.
We're lucky to have him.
I got my pen for your questions.
Let me go back to my original question. What values did your parents instill in you that have guided you in your career as a public servant?
Well, you know, I learned my values at my grandpa's kitchen table and at my dad's dining room table. For my father, everything was, he fundamentally believed that, and he was a high school educated, well-read, graceful man. But he thought that every single solitary person was entitled to be treated with dignity, and he meant it, with dignity. My dad would say, Joey, you got to be a man of your word. Without your word, you're not a man. My dad, when I lost my wife and daughter, he loved my wife, my deceased wife, and my present wife, who I met 5 years later and saved my life. And my dad, when I guess I was feeling down, came over to the house, and he was in his mid-70s, and he had gone to one of these card shops, you know, where you can buy greeting cards and you can buy those little things you put on your desk in a glass case with sayings in them, and he brought me over from a card shop, a glass case that's about 7-8 inches long and a little frame, and it had 2 frames inside of Hagar the Horrible, a cartoon character. And Hagar was the Viking. And his ship had been struck by lightning. It was going down. You could see the prow had been broken. And he's looking up at God and saying, why me, God? And the next frame, a voice from heaven comes and says, why not? That was my dad. No, my dad believed that you never complain and never explain. My dad believed that the phrase I most heard, and I was a relatively good athlete. Remember the first time I got knocked out on a football field when I was playing grade school, they call CYO football. First thing I remember is my dad leaning and whispering to me and said, Joey, if nothing's broken, get up, Joey. Get up. Get up. And so in my house, it was about getting up. And my mother would say, and I really mean this, and Ben met my mother, and a lot of you got to see my mother when we got nominated. My mother was this sweet little Irish Catholic lady, Catherine Eugenia Finnegan Biden, who had a backbone like a ramrod. And she'd say, look at me, Joey. And I mean this sincerely. Look at me. Remember, you're defined by your courage, and you're redeemed by your loyalty. You're defined by your courage, and you're redeemed by your loyalty. My mother believed the greatest virtue of all was courage, because as she would say, without it, you could not love with abandon. And so I was raised in my faith and my home with this notion that the world doesn't know you're living. You got to get up. There is no excuse. The other phrase my mom would use, she says, as long as you're alive, you have an obligation to strive. And you're not dead till you've seen the face of God. And there's no malarkey, as my mother would say. I really mean it, because I was one of those lucky guys, and I'll end with this, that was raised in a household that I really mean this, my word is abiding. Everybody, every one of my friends wanted my mom as their mom. No, I really mean it. She was the mother confessor for everyone. You'd have to be home by midnight in your dates in high school. We lived in a little split-level house, about 2,500 square feet. You walk in the back door into the dining room, and immediately to the left was a little opening. There was a small kitchen, and you'd walk through an archway into the living room. And you'd walk in the back door in the dining room with my mom, and there was a little kitchen table in the corner you couldn't see. You could see the one chair furthest out. And if she was hearing one of our friends' confessions, she'd go like this as you walked in, she'd go. Keep moving. So it was, I was really lucky. And I really mean it. I was really lucky that I had the parents and grandfather that I had. So I'm not sure I've lived up to their expectation. I hope I have, but it's about honor. It's about duty. I don't know whether you remember, Admiral, I think I introduced you to my son, Major Bo Biden, who had a struggle for a year and died of cancer. And with him, you know, everything was about duty. I really mean this, about duty. And what an incredible honor it's been. And I'm sure, Admiral, you feel the same way. To be able to do something that you love and you still think means something, that it's worth it. So I owe the people of my state, I owe the people of this country an enormous debt of gratitude, because I've never once in my life wondered whether I was doing, whether it was worthwhile.
Mr. Vice Mr. Vice President, I would say that we owe you our gratitude for your long life as a public servant. But you, like Ben Barnes, were a young Turk. Ben was the lieutenant governor of this state at 30, and you were senator of your home state of Delaware at the age of 30, the youngest you can be as a U.S. senator. You came into Washington during the Nixon years, 1973. How did the Washington you saw then look like against today's Washington? How has it changed?
Well, you know, I read these biographies of me now, and they say about how Biden always knew he wanted to be a senator, always knew he was wanted to be president, always knew he'd run for president someday, et cetera. That's not true. I got involved because of Lyndon Johnson, believe it or not. Because no one has done more for civil rights in America beyond Dr. King than Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I come, no, by the way, I'm not being solicitous because I'm here at the Johnson School. I really am not. Because I fundamentally disagree with them on some other things. But I got involved as a young kid in the civil rights movement. I moved from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and if you listen to Barack, he makes me sound like a guy that climbed out of a coal mine with a lunch bucket, you know. I moved to Delaware when I was in third grade, by the way, I was at a parade. I went to a Memorial Day parade that my son loved. I took him when he was 9 years old. It was the last parade he was in as Attorney General. And I went just in his memory to the parade, and I'm walking down the parade route in a place called Hokess, Delaware, and three guys who I played ball with came running up behind me. They were all labor guys, and the Secret Service started, you know, grabbing them, and they said, "Joe, what the hell's all this stuff about Scranton? You're from Delaware, damn it, you're from Delaware. What's all this talk about Scranton?" But at any rate, oh, you think I'm joking? I'm not joking. But when I moved from Scranton, there weren't any black people in Scranton. I mean, when I say anybody, I don't think 1% of the population. What a lot of you don't know is Delaware has the 8th largest black population in America. It's a percent of population. And I remember I moved to a little steel town called Claymont, Delaware, which is right in the Pennsylvania border, a working class town. And I went to a little Catholic grade school called Holy Rosary, and my mom would drop me off in 3rd and 4th grade, and a bus would go by full of black children. And I remember the first time I saw it, I wondered why only black kids were in the bus. I remember asking my mom, for real, why are only black kids in the bus? Why aren't they coming to our school? They said, well, they got to go into Howard High School and Howard Grade School in the city of Wilmington. We were segregated by law. The first thing I got involved in as a young guy in high school, I was a pretty good ball player in all-state in high school. And, you know, the first thing I remember doing is desegregating a place we used to eat after ball games because they wouldn't let a guy named Frank Hutchins on our team, you know, he had to do takeout. I got involved. I was the only white employee in the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. My city is now over 60% African American. It was 50% then. And so I got involved thinking that someday I'd be the guy the governor would turn to. I really mean this, and say, what do we do now, Joe? I thought that was going to be my role. And in 1968, I was involved with a group of people who were mainstream Democrats to try to reform the Democratic Party. And I got back from law school, and my city was in flames. My city was the only city in the United States of America since the Civil War to be occupied by the military for 9 months. National Guard in every corner. We had a very conservative Democratic governor. Half my state talks like y'all do down here. The Delmarva Peninsula, for real. And we're trying to change the nature of the party because our governor wasn't very big on civil rights, the Democrat. And so I left the white shoe law firm that I'd gotten a job with that took a chance on me, the oldest law firm in the state. One day after being in federal court, walked across what we call Rodney Square. If you do any corporate work, you probably handle cases in Delaware. More major corporate cases are handled in the Delaware Chancery Court than any court in America. And I walked across to the basement of a catty-corner building, and I walked in. There was a guy named Franny Kearns. I said, I want to be a public defender. He looked at me, he said, what's the matter with you? Aren't you with Prickett, Ward, Burton, Sanders? And I said, I can't do it. My city's in trouble. And so I started off as a public defender, and I ended up representing people accused of burning down the city, which they did not do. And, you know, that's what I got involved with. And then I got a call one day, as we're trying to reform the party, I got a call from a group of Democrats saying, we'd like you to run for the state Senate. I said, I can't do that. I just started my own law firm. I can't do it. It's in Dover. I can't. And they came back and said, how about the county council, which has 7 times bigger district? Because my state's like a miniature Illinois. One county has 62% of the population. And I said, I can't do that. They said, you dummy. They meet across the street there in that building twice a week at night. You can do it. So once I was assured no Democrat had ever won that district, I ran. No, swear to God. Because I was trying to build a party. And I won. And I was the only Democrat in the state that won a contested seat that year in 1970. When I mean contested, we won the solid Democratic districts. Next thing I know, I got put on a commission to try to find somebody to run for the United States Senate. I've been elected to a 4-year term. The Republicans were smarter than we were, and they decided in the decennial census of 70 to reapportion me. They put me back to a 2-year term and put me in a 68% Republican district. As Ben knows, the phrase is up or out. And so I decided I wasn't going to run. I was going to devote my time to my law practice and still stay involved in public life. And I was down at a convention, and off-year convention in Dover, Delaware, in one of those 2-story motels where you're walking the outside, and I'm in my skivvies, I'm shaving, going to the night session, and a bang on the door. And I opened the door, and the 4 leading members of the party were there. Former Chief Justice, Rhodes Scholar, Justice Tunnell, whose family had more United States senators than any family in American history. The chairman of the party, a big old boy, 6'7", Governor Carville, a former governor of the state, and a former congressman. Here I am with shaving cream and my underwear. And it was one of those motels where the headboard is nailed to the wall and the desk is nailed to the wall. So I said, excuse me, gentlemen. I ran in, put a towel around me, took the shaving cream off, and sat on that desk feeling like a damn fool. And they're sitting on the bed, 4 of them, looking at me. And Justice Tunnell, who was a Rhodes Scholar, looked at me and said, Joe, we just had dinner. We think you should run for the Senate. And I looked at him like, what in the hell's the matter? What do they drink at this? And next thing, one thing led to another. I said, Mr. Justice, I'm too young. I'm only 29. He said, Joe, obviously you didn't do well in constitutional law. He said, the Constitution says you can't be sworn in till you're 30, but your state can elect you at any time, and you only have to wait 17 days to be sworn in. I remember riding home thinking, what in the devil just happened? One thing led to another. I'd done a lot of work trying to recruit people to run for the Senate, so I knew the state well. And next thing I know, I was running. Richard Nixon won my state by 68% of the vote. A name that Ben will remember, a guy named J. Caleb Boggs, a really fine man with an 84% favorable rating. He was beating me 54-19 the week after Labor Day. But I had my sister doing my campaign, put together 20,000 volunteers, and I ran on a program that I sometimes talk to Linda Robb about, that I think maybe this is where I was odds. That I ran on the program as saying we have a crisis in confidence in America, because the country was more divided on issues then in '72 than they are today on issues. The Vietnam War was ripping families apart. The women's movement was viewed as some kind of radical thing, not a joke. The environmental movement was viewed as a plot by a bunch of Greens to try to go after corporate America. And the list went on. But the political system worked. I got elected with 3,100 votes, landslide. And I came to Washington. And at the time I came to Washington, there were still a lot of people there who were the old segregationists. James O. Eastland, Homan Talmadge, the whole, one of the meanest, smartest guy I ever met, McClellan from Arkansas, and John Stennis, who became a supporter and friend of mine, etc. And as vicious as the fights were still over civil rights in '72, when the debate was over, we'd all go down and have lunch or dinner together. The system worked because we went after each other's judgment, but not after their motive. So when I got elected in '72, I didn't want to go to the Senate because I said my family my wife and daughter had been killed between December the 18th. And my two boys were very, very badly injured and still hospitalized. But a group of senators came to see me, including Lloyd Bentsen, and came and said, look, just come for 6 months. We need you to organize. I was so foolish that I thought they really meant it. We had 58 Democratic senators. They didn't need me to organize. But I really believed it, so I said I'd come. And I was supposed to come, as Ben will remember, and I didn't show up the day I was supposed to be sworn in. So the next day, Senator Mansfield sent up the Secretary of the Senate and swore me in the hospital. And I went down very reluctantly. And Senator Mansfield, the majority leader, would have me come to his office once a week and give me an assignment. No senator gets an assignment. But I actually thought senators got assignments. No, I really did. Hell, I'm the first U.S. senator I knew. And so, and it's a long answer to a short question, but it's a profound question. And what he was doing, it took me about 2 months to figure it out, is basically taking my pulse, see if I was okay, how I was. He'd always sit behind his desk with a corncob pipe, very seldom ever light it, and he'd give me an assignment and talk to me. One day in the end of May, I came walking through those doors, those double doors you see all the time on C-SPAN. I walked down to the well of the Senate on my way to meet Senator Mansfield for my 3 o'clock meeting. I'd always walk to the well of the Senate and check with the Secretary of the Senate when the last vote was going to be so I could get in the train and go home and see my boys. And as I walked in, Jesse Helms, who got elected the same year I did from North Carolina, was excoriating two people who became very close friends of mine. One still is. Bob Dole, Republican, and Teddy Kennedy. He was excoriating them for introducing the precursor to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he was standing there saying the government has no responsibility to the handicapped, and why should you impose on business people to have access into their business and buy taxpayer? And I thought, God, this is heartless. And I walked in and I sat down in front of Mansfield. I guess I looked angry. And he's always spoke in clipped tones. He said, what's the matter, Joe? And then I went after Jesse Helms and saying he had no social redeeming value. He did this. I couldn't understand how. No, I really did. He sat there and listened, and then he looked at me and taught me the best lesson I ever learned in public life. He said, Joe, what would you say if I told you 2.5 years ago Dot and Jesse Helms were sitting in their living room in Raleigh, North Carolina, reading the Raleigh Observer. And there's a photograph of a 14-year-old young man in braces from his chest down his legs, steel braces, both legs, and steel crutches, standing there saying, all I want for Christmas is someone to love me and take me home. He said, Joe, what would you say if I told you Dot and Jesse Helms adopted that young man as their own? I said, I'd feel foolish, Mr. Leader. He said, well, he did, Joe. And he said, I've learned something here. It's always appropriate to question another man or woman's judgment. It's never appropriate to question their motive because you don't know their motive. And that's why I'm going to say something that is unnecessarily self-serving. That's why every single time you saw a problem in the Senate or the House, in the 8 years we're here, in the 36 years I was in the Senate, I'm the guy that gets called up to try to settle it. Because I have enormous respect for my Republican as well as my Democratic colleagues. And I've never questioned their judgment. Today, it's gotten mean and visceral. And it's always about your judgment. If you disagree with me, you're in the pocket of big business, or you're in the pocket of this, or you're unethical. And guys, in this democracy, the way the founders separated powers wisely is nothing can happen without consensus. And it's virtually impossible to reach consensus after you've attacked the integrity of another man or woman. You can't get to go. That's what's changed. Think of the nature of the debate the last 12 years. You're a bad person. You're an unethical person. You're not a Christian. You're un-American. And so, folks, the thing that's changed is that plus one other thing. When we first got to the Senate, and by the way, Phil Graham in Texas, he's my friend. I nicknamed him, and he loved it, Barbed Wire Graham, when he got there. And I still call him that. But as much as we disagreed, we could reach a consensus. When I wrote the crime bill, he's the guy that compromised with me. Only got 7 Republican votes, but he compromised with me. When Strom Thurmond died at age 100, I got a call from the hospital from his wife, Nancy. She said, I'm here at the nurse's station with doctor, and I forget his doctor's name. Strom asked if I'd call you, Joe, and ask for a favor. I said, how is he, Nancy? He said, he's on God's time. I said, what can I do, Nancy? Anything. He said, Strom asked if you would do his eulogy. I did Strom Thurmond's eulogy, and I didn't lie at all. Because he was a product of his time. He changed with his time. By the time he died, he had a larger percentage of blacks in the staff than any senator in the United States Senate, including Ted Kennedy. He voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So, folks, what's different today is we don't know each other. Ask your Republican or Democratic colleagues in the House. Ask them if they know the wife of or the child of their colleague. There used to be a dining room in the Senate. There was a private dining room where I would be able to take you as a guest. But then there was a super private dining room right across the hall with 2 large dining room tables and a buffet, a Democratic table and a Republican table. Ted Kennedy came to me 3 months in and said, Joe, you've got to go to lunch over there. You want to learn about the Senate. Sit there from 12:15 until 1:30. You'll learn more than you'll ever learn anywhere else. When you get to know that a senator's wife has breast cancer, or a senator's husband has an alcohol problem, or a son or daughter has a drug problem, or a mother and father lost everything through bankruptcy, it's hard to dislike that person. You get to know them. You get to know who they are. It doesn't change your view on their views, but you actually get to know people. Because of my strong relationships to this day with the Senate, I don't say who it is, and I won't because I don't want to hurt them, but I meet regularly with the Republican Senator leadership now as a guy that's outside office. I went up to the Senate, 2 years left in our term, and I went to the private Senate dining room to sit down and talk to these women and men that I've known. And I walked in, and it's gone. No more dining room tables. There's lounge chairs. No place to eat together. We used to travel together. I got to know Lloyd Vance and his wife, same party, by traveling with them abroad. We used to know each other's spouses. There's no camaraderie anymore. And that's why it makes it easier to question motive. And two more things have changed. When we lost so many governorships in 2010, they took gerrymandering to an art form. You know, there's only about 45 House seats out of 435 that are contestable. You could go out and do an unnatural act in a town square if you are in an overwhelmingly Republican or Democratic district. And someone from the other party is not going to beat you. But what's happened with that and unlimited money? Look at every single race that gets lost by people of competence. It's generating the extremes. Because now the worry is, do I lose a primary? And the Democratic Party that's forcing people more to the left, the Republican Party to the right. When President and I, and on my recommendation, I didn't have to, he was going there anyway, decided to name to the Supreme Court, a year out almost, someone who was a federal judge, and over 42 Republicans had said how good a person he was before this. We were doing it because in a divided government, my argument was, you make a compromise. You don't try. The Senate has a right to have their view. Merrick Garland. And they didn't have a hearing. Wouldn't even have a hearing. So I called up a dozen of my Republican colleagues, who I know well, my friends. And I said, you can't do this. It's damaging the institution. And with one exception, I got the same answer. I know, Joe, it's wrong. But Joe, if I go ahead and do this, I'll have a primary. The Koch brothers will drop $6 to $8, $10 million in my race. I'll be in trouble, Joe. It's no excuse not to have the courage to do the right thing, but it's an example of how much, and Democrats are no different in that regard. So look what's happened. We now have an environment where when things are going bad and people are justifiably frightened and scared, that we have this appeal, this populism, nationalism. Do you think that, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, do you think that the team running the show now really cares about poor folk? No, I mean, I think they care, don't get me wrong. But do you think their populist views are about that? This is as old as history. When people are frightened, they don't know what to do, and things aren't going well for them, find someone to blame. The other. That immigrant took my job. That black guy you so much for and not for me. That woman who you pushed ahead just because she's a woman. Think of what's happened. And it's not just in the United States. It's around the world. And it's as old as history. And what in the process is suffering? I'll end with this. the institutions. Our founding fathers, I suffer from having taught constitutional law for 22 years. But all kidding aside, everything about who we are as a nation has been designed to limit the aggregation of power, to prevent the abuse of power. That's why there's 3 equal branches of government. What has been the first attack from the last 2 years? First of all, on the press. Delegitimize the press, and you've opened up a great highway. And then go after the courts as being illegitimate. Jerome Frank wrote a famous piece called Law in the Modern Mind. He talked about the judicial myth, the need in a society like ours to believe that and have it reinforced, that the justice system is dispensing justice. So what's happened now? There's been an overwhelming attempt and targeted to delegitimize the courts, to delegitimize the press. And I heard a particular person quote Jefferson. He's never read Jefferson. No, I mean this sincerely. Jefferson said, and I'm paraphrasing, give me a choice between this government and democracy or a free press. I'll choose the free press to protect my independence and security. And so, guys, this is real. This goes beyond the present president, and it goes beyond what I'm worried is happening, may happen in my own party. So what's changed is the political system has broken down. Because if you look at every single issue, including the most controversial, same-sex marriage, 56% of the people say that's okay. 68% of the people say we should be engaged in massive expenditures in infrastructure. I can go down the list. Name me one major issue where the American public is divided based on polling. But the parties are broken and they're polarized. We've got to change it for our own safety's sake.
Mr. Vice President. You talked about Trump's ability and his populist campaign to foment fear. You are as in touch with the everyman as any politician. You have a reputation for that. It might be part of your background as a son of Scranton. But did the backlash that we heard so thunderously from the so-called forgotten men and women surprise you in 2016?
I should be more humble and say yes, but it didn't. I made 83 campaign events for Hillary. I think she would have been a fine president. I really mean that. I did 83 events for her. And thousands and thousands of people. But I told my staff, my key political staff, and Barack, who disagreed with me, about 5 weeks out, I thought we were going to lose. Because, and my staff was worried that what I'm about to say would offend the press. For example, the Shorenstein School of Public Policy at Harvard University did a study of all the words uttered in the campaign covered by the press as well as by the candidates. And only 4% of the words uttered were about an issue. 4%. Let's assume they're off by 100%, 300%. No, I really mean this. And I think we so vastly underestimated the Trump campaign and Mr. Bannon. The things that would have been totally disqualifying in the minds of every elected Democrat and Republican, no matter how tough and rough they were able to be said by and done by the president. And you wonder why he didn't try to explain his way out of that. But think about it. Talking about touching women in private places, talking about all the things that happened. John McCain, he likes heroes that didn't get captured, etc. But think what it did. It took the eye off the ball. I remember going into, I would sit down with Hillary's campaign staff once a week, and they'd assign me places to go based on where I had some strength, with millennials, with working class folks, with the African American community, etc. So I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, and Virginia. And I remember I had sort of an epiphany flying to, I think it was Lorain, Ohio. Don't hold me to the town, but one of the many towns in Ohio. And all of a sudden it dawned on me. Think about it, Joe. No coverage of any of the issues. Hillary had a clear, whether you agreed or not, a clear plan about how she was going to pay for education, and 12 years was not enough. She had a clear plan why, probably in Austin, I know in Philadelphia, Houston, major cities in America, if you have 2 kids and you want decent child care, it costs $20,000 a year. Working women are pretty smart. Educated women are pretty smart. Unless you're getting paid a hell of a lot more than $20,000 a year, it's not worth the effort. And so if you had a plan to treat that as a deduction like corporation, you can legitimately deduct business expenses. But no one, this audience, really informed people. Maybe some of you are yellow dog Democrats, and maybe some of you are Republicans. But you can't tell me what Hillary's plans were. It wasn't because she didn't have them. Soon as it'd start, he'd turn and talk about Bill Clinton, or he'd talk about secret or servers. And look at his son and his son-in-law. I mean, he talk about training the. Now, by the way, I'm not attacking them. I'm just saying what I know. I really mean it. It's much of it is irrelevant. But you never got to the issues. We never got to the issues. And it was clear to me. And I'll be blunt with you. For you Democrats who are in the audience, I hope you're not offended, but there's a false debate now going on in my party about having to choose between civil rights, civil liberties, and working class people. That's like asking me to choose between my heart and my soul. I take a backseat to no one on civil rights and civil liberties and human rights, women's rights. No one. But I'm also, according to the polls, one of the most popular people in the country with working class people, because where I come from, they're not at odds. To make the point, the campaign, I was up in Northeast Ohio at an automobile plant, a Ford plant, with several thousand people. And I asked him to send a serious campaign person with me. And I started off with these hard-working, middle-class, in terms of salary, men and women. I imagine very few, if any, had a college degree. And I said, we have to elect Hillary Clinton because it's about time women made as much as men for the same work. The place went nuts, clapping. And I remember all the liberals looking around going, what that's about? They don't get it. Guess what? When your wife's not getting paid, your standard of living is going down. They all had wives who worked. They were angry that they were getting paid fairly. There's no conflict. I said, and any man who raises his hand to a woman is a coward. They went nuts, cheering. It's working class Democrats, some of whom left us, because they have daughters. They have moms. They have sisters. This is a false choice. But we never got to it. And now there's this ascent. I said this false debate. The American people are decent. Whenever average Americans have been given half a chance, they have never let their country down. Does anyone think the reason we have EITC or food stamp kind of programs is because of the wealthy? It's the middle class. Middle class Americans are the ones who have said, this is what we should do. Their values are, they really, think about it. What defines us as Americans? You can't define an American based on race, ethnicity, religious beliefs. There's only one thing. A fundamental commitment, whether you're naturalized or native born, to the notion that's contained in the Constitution. It's about ideas. We hold these truths self-evident. Sounds corny, but think about it. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty. That's what Americans believe in their gut. There are prejudiced people. There are mean people. But the vast majority of the American people are really decent. Really decent. And folks, look, I used to always get kidded by Lloyd Benson and my senior colleagues because I was quoting Irish poets on the floor. And they thought it was because I was Irish. That's not why I quoted them. I quoted them because they're simply the best poets. But all kidding aside, there's a line from William Butler Yeats's poem about the first rising in Ireland in 1960. It's called Easter Sunday, 1960. And it says the following. All's changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. You students are here. Think about how fundamentally things have changed in the world since the year 2000. It's a fundamentally different world. We're no longer a bipolar world, one superpower. We're dealing with stateless actors that the Admiral was talking about earlier, that are inciting fear in people, even though they're no existential threat to our security. Just since 2000, look how automation, digitalization, artificial intelligence has displaced workers. Just in the last 9 months now, we've lost over almost 200,000 retail workers. People who hate middle-class living. We've lost 100,000 bank tellers because that iPhone I have now, I do all my banking on. The world's changing. Look at the world. Everything's changing, and it always takes government time to catch up. So, think about the last race. Hillary tried, but it would never get covered by the press. Tell me the last time, those of you who are a little bit older, remember an entire campaign for president and the plight of the middle class was never really mentioned. Now, I know I'm called Middle Class Joe, for real, that's what I'm referred to. And in Washington, that's not meant as a compliment. It means I'm not sophisticated. But I'm pretty damn sophisticated about the middle class. The reason why we are who we are is because we've had a thriving, rising middle class with promise. It's provided for our social stability and our political stability. This notion of promise. I know President Xi Jinping better than any leader in the world because I've spent more time with him than any leader in the world. I've had 25 hours of private dinners with him in China and here. Just me, and the Admiral may remember when his predecessor as president, and Obama had a state dinner. They thought that she and I should get to know one another. So I traveled 18,000 miles with him in China, 7,000 miles here. And I was in Chengdu, a town that was a city on the Tibetan plateau that was, I think it was like 6 million people a decade ago, now 22 million people. And he asked me, he said, "Can you define America for me?" I said, "Yes, I can." True story. In one word, possibilities. We're the only nation in the world, including our great allies, who have believed and is viewed by others as American arrogance, that we can do anything, anything, anything. That if you remotely play by the rules, you got an even chance. There's possibilities. Get my kid an education. Give her a chance. We can do anything. And think about it, guys. Because of digitalization, Moore's Law, artificial intelligence, you students who are even graduate students, in the next 10 years, you're going to see more change than we've seen in the last 50 years. Within a decade or more, we're going to be flying subsonically at 22,000 miles an hour. We're going to be curing cancer. We're going to fundamentally alter the way we do things. But the big scare is, with legitimacy, I spoke at Davos at the World Economic Forum. I was asked to speak there about the fourth industrial revolution. Will there be middle-class jobs? There's a real debate whether they will. A big debate, for example, between two well-known guys, Elon Musk and the chairman of the board of Google. One thinks it's great, one thinks it's a disaster. So people are uncertain out there, and we're not talking to them. We're not saying, look, the answer is not nationalism. The answer is not pulling back. The answer is not engaging in trade. That's counterproductive. If you said to the guys in my neighborhood, and I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, there was no hard-scrapple stuff. If you said to my dad, "Joe, I can promise you to get a $1,000 a year raise," which was a lot of money in 1965 or 68, a year, or I can send your kid to college for free. I can make sure your neighborhood is safe. I can make sure your energy costs are low. I can make sure that you have an even shot at a good job. Everybody in my neighborhood would take the latter. Guys, look at the University of Texas, and I'm not being solicitous, one of the great universities in the world. What's tuition now here? I don't know. For in-state students and out-of-state students. My University of Delaware, ranked one of the 4th or 5th best state universities. In-state student is now close to 30 grand a year. Out-of-state students is 45 or something. I got a granddaughter at Columbia Law School, the 2nd or 3rd ranked law school in America. $84,000 a year. I got another granddaughter at the University of Pennsylvania, $72,000 a year. My entire career, I was listed as the poorest man in the Senate. Not a joke. I made a bad mistake. The last debate I had when I was running, the guy was very angry. I was winning the debate, and a supporter of my opponent stood up and said, "Well," this was Nixon and B.B. Rebosa. Remember that name? You're giving Nixon oil stock. He said, "What's your position on owning stock? And what's your position on honoraria? And what's your position on staying in your law firm?" All of which you're allowed to do. I said, why I said it, I don't know. I said, "I promise you, as long as I hold public office, I'll never own a stock, a bond, or a debenture." I didn't know what the hell a debenture was. I don't know why I said that. And I said, "I commit to you, as long as I'm in public office, I will never take an honorarium. For anyone who has an interest before Congress, and I commit to you, I will never be engaged in a business enterprise, even if it's permissible." Ergo, when I did my financial disclosure as vice president, you can Google it, front page of the Washington Post, quote, "It's probable no man has ever assumed the office of vice president with fewer assets than Joe Biden." But the bottom line, guys, is that, look, it is, there's a lot going on, and people have a reason to be frightened. So I did this speech at the World Economic Forum. 2,800 CEOs and 88 heads of state. And we talked about, will there be a middle class? And people out there with jobs now, they're scared to death. They see what's happening. And they don't know how government has always intervened in the previous 4 industrial revolutions to balance things. They don't know what's going to happen to them. Last point I'll make. There used to be a basic bargain in America that Democrats and Republicans subscribed to. That if you participated in the success of the enterprise with which you were engaged, you got to share in the benefits. Now, granted, globalization has affected that. Digitalization has affected some of it. But guys, since the end of World War II to 1978, productivity grew 92%. Wages grew 92%. From 78 to 2016, productivity grew 68%. Wages grew 8%. 8%. CEOs are good people. Used to make 40 times their average employee when Reagan was president. Now it's 400 times as much. I have a cartoon, Admiral, in my office. When you're in there, you may have seen it. It's from the New Yorker. It's a picture of a big old fat guy with a black turtleneck and black mask and a black beret, sitting at a table being interrogated by a cop on the other side. And there's a big bag on the table marked with a $ sign on it. And he's looking at the investigator. He said, "How was I supposed to know he was a job creator?" Guys, since when are the only job creators stockholders? My father managed an automobile dealership, never owned it. Created a whole hell of a lot of jobs selling those cars. But think about it. Think about it. 8% raise in salary since 1978. But that bargain is now broken. It's not anybody's fault. I'm not blaming, I think rich folks are as patriotic as poor folks. I really mean it. Ben knows me well. I was elected the senator from DuPont, as they used to say, from Delaware, for 36 years. I'm not anti-business. But think how corporate culture has changed. It's all about short-termism now. A group of people came to me, including the head of the Business Roundtable, asking me, as a Democrat, whether I had had an effort to begin to focus on long-termism. BlackRock, the head of the CEOs of 7 of the top 25 corporations in America are meeting with them. Because guess what? We're eating our own seed corn. And it's not because of any one thing, it's because of the way things have evolved. But folks, we gotta speak to the fears. You know, I'm receiving an award from CSIS, and it's called the Big New Brzezinski Award. And it's tomorrow night, and I was preparing a speech for it. And I looked up a quote from Zbig, who I knew well. And here's what he said. He said, "Fear obscures reason, intensifies emotions, and makes it easier for demagogic politicians to mobilize the public on behalf of policies they want to pursue." The idea that terrorism And you're 10 times as likely to be struck by lightning as you are to be taken down by terrorist act. I'm not making light of it. But think of why so many Americans are understandably frightened. Think about the other things that are going on in their lives that frighten them. And that's when people play to their fears. We are better positioned than any country in the world to own the 21st century. By a long shot. We're energy independent in a de facto way. We're the most productive workers in the world, 3 times as productive as workers in Asia. We have the most agile venture capitalists in the world. We have more great research universities, including this campus I'm on, than all the rest of the world combined. The press is here, let me say it again. All the rest of the world combined because of a guy named Dwight Eisenhower. During Sputnik, he appointed a group that was called in, you wouldn't call it that these days, 20 wise men. And they recommended a massive investment in federal research. He said, I'll do some of that at defense, but I'm going to invest in research universities. Because of Lincoln, we have land-grant colleges in every state. That's why who the hell we are. That's where all the energy, that's where all the ingenuity, that's where all this incredible change. China. I want China to do well. But ladies and gentlemen, when I came back after the final meeting with Xi Jinping, the president asked me, tell me about him. You know personalities. I said, he has the look of a man who's about to take on a job he knows is not likely to end well. Not a joke. 40% of their arable land is polluted with cadmium. They're talking about a $2 trillion project to turn around both their rivers because they don't have enough water, not energy, water to drink. They're in a position where there's enormous division within the country between the coast and inland, as there always have been. They have a group of princelings who continue to run the country and who are corrupt. But as you see from Xi Jinping, he's trying to figure it out. Everybody, no matter whether you're a fascist, a communist, a Democrat, whatever you are, corruption eats away at the fabric of society. Nobody likes it. We were talking about the environment. I suggested to the president that the answer lies in talking to China. Last time I was in China, people are wearing masks. 4 million people are dying a year from the smog, the smoke, and the air impurities. As I used to say in Claymont, where I'm from, I wish them well, but they're not a patch on our genes. America is so incredibly well positioned. If we just get out of our own way, pick our heads up, look ahead, remember who we are, and stop this consistent attempt to damage the institutions that have made us who we are for the last 200 plus years. I can answer yes or no if you don't ask me an essay question. I'll try. I'm sorry. I'm a little too passionate. I apologize.
Our time is going short, and we're eager to hear your views on recent events. Earlier this week, we saw the greatest mass shooting in U.S. history, and you tweeted afterward, "How long do we let gun violence tear us apart? Enough. Congress and the White House should act now to save lives. There's no excuse for inaction." During the Obama-Biden administration, we saw the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, among other mass shootings. That stirred the conscience of the nation, and yet we saw no gun control reform. What can Congress do now to get meaningful gun control legislation through?
The president asked me after Sandy Hook whether I would put together a plan to deal with the excesses that exist. And I'm the guy that wrote the crime bill, and that's the one that dealt with a lot of things that could not be reauthorized when George Bush took office. And I like President Bush. I really do. He's a friend. But I believe in the Second Amendment. I really do, not a joke. I have 5 or 6 guns. They're all shotguns. They're all... But the Constitution does not, going back to, we could argue about whether or not a well-armed militia, what it meant, and whether it limits, it gives the government power. No one's ever argued, until recently, that the government doesn't have a right to limit or eliminate certain kinds of weapons. You can't own a tank. Some people have the money to buy it, not a joke. Remember that DuPont, who had the wrestling camp? He had all these weapons. You can't own a flamethrower. You can't go out and purchase and own a bazooka. Does the government have a right to say there's certain kinds of weapons you can't own? Well, we have for our entire history thought it had. The court has upheld that. Secondly, it is really important, and we wouldn't stop all these things, but that there are certain people who under the Constitution are legitimately able to be denied the ability to purchase, own, or keep a weapon. Convicted felons. I don't know anybody out there except some of the NRA who say, no, felons should be able to own weapons. Convicted felons. People with serious mental problems. You can deny them the right to drive an automobile if it's legitimate, if they have serious psychiatric analysis. You can deny them the right to do certain things. You can't deny them the right to be denied in a background check, the ownership of a weapon. So I'm not suggesting that all or even most of the violent crime with a weapon can be stopped. Most of the people who are killed by a weapon are killed at their own hand, suicide. But it seems to me there should be some rationality in saying, can you own a weapon that was designed to be an assault weapon? It has no purpose. Deers aren't wearing Kevlar vests. No, I'm not joking. My father, I was never a hunter. My father was a hunter. Bear, deer up in the Poconos. But folks, the idea that you're able to purchase a conversion kit that can basically turn a certain weapon into an automatic weapon? For what purpose? The notion was to be able to defend yourself. One of the notions was to defend yourself against the incursion of the government. Well, that was the fundamental purpose. We should be able to own our own tanks. I mean, follow this logically. You have to agree with me, but the logic. And so the notion of stricter background checks and the notion of certain weapons not being able to be sold. When I wrote these 40 proposals for the president, I saw the polling data. A majority of NRA members agreed with me. 78% of the people on average in the country agreed. But they're very powerful. And it's not just the NRA, they're a powerful lobby. And gun manufacturers. It's a business, man. It's like saying to the DuPont company, you can't produce Freon anymore. They're not going to say that's a good idea. So folks, we don't know enough about this particular guy. But it's not unreasonable to say there should be a limit on what you could own, because it is indicative. All the journals will point out that with notable exceptions, the amassing of weapons gives some insight into person's stability, unless you're a formal collector. So I just think that, more people have been killed in America by senseless acts of gun violence committed by American citizens who are not terrorists in the term of the word that is used, than by terrorists. But we seem to go, oh, okay, Columbine. You go down the list. But what happens, understandably, when Boston happens, and what happens in other places, we go crazy. It's about human life. It's about common sense. And it's not about denying anyone. And I'll give you a concluding comment. When I was vice president, I proposed we invest considerably more money. I'm not suggesting by mentioning his name the Admiral agrees with me at all. I don't know his position. But the Admiral knows we have the technology to be able to produce a weapon only function in the hand of a single person by being able to have its fingerprint, its DNA, its identification, that you pull the trigger, only one person can pull the trigger. It's within our technological capability to produce such a weapon. So I proposed that we invest considerably more money in research that would not in any way affect anyone's right to own a weapon, or any weapon for that matter. So the only person who could fire the weapon is the person who purchased the weapon, whose name that weapon was. So you wouldn't have a young man at Columbine getting his mom's weapons and using them, which is a lot of what happens. Or you wouldn't have the accidental shooting of young children because of weapons left there without a trigger lock. And so there were two large gun shops who supported this. And they had on display a weapon that can only be used by the person purchasing it. I mean, as a practical, literally, physically, the trigger could not be pulled by someone who wasn't fitted for that weapon. And they got so much heat from the NRA, and they got blocked, and they swore they would never again display a weapon that could only be used by the purchaser. Now, what does that have to do with the Second Amendment? You're entitled to own a weapon, whether you think it's needed to defend against the police, the government, or your physical safety in the neighborhood you live. You can buy it. You can fire it. But your kid can't pick it up. So tell me, ask yourself, as I used to say when I was in grade school, examine your conscience. Not a joke. Do you think this is really about the Second Amendment? Or do you think at its base, for the most strenuous advocates for gun sales, is about selling weapons and profit? What is the rationale based on the Second Amendment that says we have the technological capability to develop a means by which only one hand can fit that weapon, the weapon read that, just like you walk in and put your handprint in some security places, the maximum I have to go. How does that deny your right to own a weapon? So folks, all I'm asking for, and I genuinely do support the Second Amendment, all I'm asking for is some rationality, some honest to God debate about what is this really about. Some of it is, there's some people on my side of the aisle would, if they could, they'd take away every weapon that existed. That's not what I'm saying. So, we still don't know. I talked to Jim Marin, who is the chairman of the board of MGM, as I got off the plane today, because I know him, and asked if there's anything I could do to help, because it was at his property that this happened. And he told me about one of his security guards who was on the 35th or whatever floor it was, who was the guy who identified where this guy was. Tried to break the door down, got shot, but in the meantime, SWAT teams got up there and they stopped this guy, and he had more ammunition in place than he had already fired, probably saving hundreds of lives, not hyperbole. But I asked, what do we know about this guy? I'm not saying this guy didn't pass a background check for everything he got. We can't stop all this. But we at least should have some rational basis upon which to agree is the limits and the necessity of the Second Amendment. We'd save a lot of lives. We'd save a lot of lives.
Our time is growing short, but I do want to ask you, I want to go back to this president and to an article that you wrote right after Charlottesville in the Atlantic Monthly. You wrote, "We are living through a battle for the soul of our nation." And you went on to write about our president, his contempt for the U.S. Constitution and willingness to divide us knows no bounds. I'm wondering, what actions of President Trump gives you the greatest concern?
Look, Barack and I have been out of office now for, 9 months or whatever it's been, 10 months, 9 months. And we've really tried to give the incoming administration a chance to get started, just like W did, just like his father did, just like Clinton did. It's the right thing to do. They won the election. And so if you notice, you haven't heard me commenting on much of what the president has done in terms of foreign policy, in terms of national security policy. I have fundamental disagreements with him. I'm sure Admiral McRaven's been importuned like I have. I've had 12 heads of state call me already, wanting me to come and meet with them. The Admiral will tell you I was the go-to guy in the administration. When I was the guy who dealt with most heads of state. The reason is, in the Secretary of State, both Hillary and John Kerry were brilliant. Gates, Panetta, they were really good. But everybody knew, because of my relationship with the president, there's no power in the vice presidency. It's all reflective. But everyone knew, including I think you, Admiral, that if I had said something, and I said this is what it is, you knew I was speaking for the president. No one ever doubted it. And so I have these relationships because I was put in charge of, because the president had everything but locust land on his desk the first 5 years. And by the way, no president in modern times is able to do it alone. He's got to delegate major responsibility to somebody. Because of my relationship and the trust we have with him, he delegated major responsibility to me. Iraq, Ukraine, the Northern Triangle, Eastern Europe. And I have had, and I've not been able, I believe that I should never be critical of a president, no matter how fundamentally I disagree with him when I'm abroad. And I can't be with other heads of state, with heads of state, stating a position contrary to the president. It's not my role to set that foreign policy. So if you notice, and I'm going to say something outrageous, the admiral's an expert on special operations. The Navy SEALs are the best in the world. I'm referred to as an expert on foreign policy. I take a backseat to no one in terms of the depth and breadth of what I've been engaged in. Doesn't mean I'm right, but I am not uninformed. So I've kept my mouth shut about my fundamental disagreements with the president on so many things. But the one thing I can't keep my mouth shut on is when we attack fundamental principles that define us as a country. Not, forget what he said comparing, not speaking out unequivocally with no comma or semicolon about Nazis marching in our streets is reprehensible. Because for the longest time I've given the president the benefit of the doubt because he doesn't know public office. He was a businessman. So I gave him a lot of benefit of the doubt saying that, well, he doesn't understand that president's words matter. No, but I mean, just utterances, they matter. Governor, I had to go over when Helmut Schmidt was the Chancellor of Germany. Ed Muskie was Secretary of State. Jimmy Carter was president. And it was about intermediate range ballistic missiles. And I had to go over and explain. I was asked by the President and the Secretary of State to go sit with Helmut Schmidt and try to work out a modus vivendi with the Germans, which were important. I'll never forget what Schmidt said. We were sitting across a very small conference table in his office. And he got frustrated with me. He said, Joe, this is God's truth. Joe, you don't understand. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold. When a president, look, we have the strongest military in the history of the world, the finest fighting force in the history of the world, not hyperbole. We're respected, and we are feared by those who would do us harm. But the reason why we're able to lead the world is not the example of our power, but the power of our example. That's what has made the rest of the world repair to us. That's what allows us to put together alliances. That's what allows us to generate consensus in the world. If there's anything we need today, is America's leadership and a continuation of the liberal world order set up after World War II that's provided so much prosperity and security for us. But it's under siege now. So when the president says things like complimenting Putin for being tough, what do you do if you are the prime minister or president in Romania, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, the Balkans? What do you think? You're sitting there What do you think about when a president says, I'm not sure about this NATO commitment unless everybody's paid up? What do you think the United States will do in that circumstance? When little green men, Russian soldiers in uniform without insignia, cross the border. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, large Russian-speaking populations. Ukraine. Look what's going on in Romania, Hungary, today. What happens is, you decide, since you're weak and the neighbor of the bear is breathing down your neck, and it looks like the United States is giving them a pass, you make accommodations. You make an accommodation. What Putin is all about today is taking down that world order. He's not trying to reestablish the Soviet empire. He doesn't have the ability to do that. Right now, but for nuclear weapons, Russia's a third-rate power. They're losing population. They're down to 145 million people. They have the highest rate of alcoholism and AIDS. They don't know how to get the oil out of the ground that they have. For real. For real. So what do you do in that circumstance? You undermine the institutions that were built internationally to prevent the abuse of power. NATO, the EU, the ASEAN countries. Because what do the Chinese and the Russians want? They want to maintain a sphere of influence as wide as it can be without the ability of any collective group to do anything about it. So what happens if they break down NATO or the EU? They deal with then 28 small countries or medium-sized countries, none of whom have the power or capability to resist their use of corruption, energy, oligarchs, to undermine democracy in the region. That's what this is all about. So, when the president embraces this crazy man in the Philippines, who is absolutely going out and having extrajudicial killings, what did you think that message that sends in South Asia? Not a joke. I mean, think about it. And when the President of the United States compares those who are opposing Nazis and white supremacists in the historic town of Charlottesville, it allows people to crawl out from under the rocks. It gives them license. They're a small percentage of the American people. The president's words matter. Matter. And I can't remain silent. I cannot remain silent on those fundamental issues. Because think about it, folks. Did any of you think these elements would go quietly into the night? Do you think that if we didn't apply the total moral disapprobation of society to white supremacists, Nazis, separatists, that they would go away? And so what happens now? People think they can say things they wouldn't have said 2 years ago because they think society will tolerate it. And it sends an awful message around the world. Reagan was right. We are the shining city on the hill. But you cannot forsake the fundamental, elemental values of this country. Because I said, we really do think we're imperfect we haven't made it yet. But ultimately, we always have responded to Lincoln's call to appeal to our better angels. Sometimes it takes time. But my Lord, if a president remains silent or unintentionally or intentionally gives sustenance to these people crawling out from the fields and the darkness, from under the rocks, it's dangerous. But it's also dangerous for our world leadership. It's not who we are as a people, and I refuse to remain silent about it.
Mr. Vice President, we began this conversation with you talking about your parents instilling in you the importance of honor and duty, and I think the audience would agree that you are the very personification of honor and duty. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
It's been a great honor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I tell you one quick story? Stay here. Lloyd Bentsen, in his last race, asked me to come down and campaign for him, to basically say this young guy is going to point out that Lloyd has more energy and et cetera. And so I was at A&M. And no, hang on. And it was law day. And there were about 1,000 students. It was a dinner. And Lloyd, being nice, stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce Senator Joe Biden." And I told and then he said, and besides, he was a great football player. He played for the University of Delaware. He was a fighting blue hen. They did what you did. And so the cadets just started going, "Blue hen, mate." So jokingly, I stood up thinking they had a sense of humor. And I stood up and I said, "Hook 'em horns." Well, that's only beginning. Next thing I feel is this is a God's true story. Lloyd pulled me and said, "Sit down, Joe, sit down. You're going to cost me this election." You guys really take it seriously, man. You're a great, great, great university. I'm honored to be associated with the Johnson School. I really mean it. This is, for all, remember, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in the beginning, was not at all a fan of the Vietnam War. He was one of the great skeptics about the war. And Johnson, there was a book that was written by a guy named Goldschmidt. And Goldschmidt talked about a scene in the book where he was talking about Johnson. I'll try to get the exact quote, where he said that Goldstein, the book was called Lessons in Disaster. And it was about one of the whiz kids of the Kennedy administration. It was the National Security Advisor. And his name was McGeorge Bundy. And he was a National Security Advisor. And in the book, there's a scene. After the assassination and the enormous burden that rested on President Johnson, he went down to the National Security Office, which used to be down by the Situation Room on the ground floor. It's now upstairs. And he asked Bundy to come up. And if I'm not mistaken, both Rusk and McNamara were in the office. And in the book, and McBundy said this was true when he was alive. In the book, he turned to McBundy and said, "Mac, how do we win this war?" And he said, "We don't know how to win it, but we know how not to lose it." In the meantime, another 15,000 of guys of our generation died. The point is that, for all of you students, a lot of you are turned off right now. You are part of a generation that is the most progressive, most open, most decent generation in American history by every measure, except one. Recent poll done at the Kennedy School. I did Harvard's graduation. Recent poll done. When asked about all these incredible traits of the millennial generation, which now is larger than the baby boom generation, they said, would you be willing to get involved in running or involved in public office? 5 years ago, 38% said yes. If my memory serves me, today, 7% of the women of your generation said yes, and only 12% of the men. I had a professor at Delaware, one of the most brilliant guys I've ever met, taught me. His name was David Ingersoll. And when I was out of school only about 5 years and was thinking of running for the Senate, I went for advice to him. He said, Joe, remember Plato. And I happen to remember what he used to repeat. He'd say, the penalty good people pay for not being involved in politics is being governed by people worse than themselves. There's no place for your generation to hide. None. When the environment is denigrated, you can't be safe behind your walls. When your sister is abused, you are affected. When your brother can't marry the man he loves, you are deprived. There's no place to hide, man. And to be successful and happy, I'd respectfully suggest of all the people I met, those who are the people who never rationalized. Never underestimate the ability of the human mind to rationalize. Oh, I know this is his last ball game, but I'm in the West Coast, I'll have to take the red eye back, he'll understand. No, he won't. I know it's her birthday, but I got this great opportunity for a business deal. I've got to do it. I know the family's been planning this vacation for 8 months, but they'll understand because I've got this opportunity. I promise you, you may be successful, but you'll never be happy. And your generation is the reason why I have so much faith and so much certainty in knowing that we will prevail through the 21st century because of you, but do not rationalize. Thank you so much.